Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's panel. This session is a part of our monthly series, Conversations on Europe, which is funded in part by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission and through a National Resource Centers grant from the US Department of Education. This year, our sessions have been organized around our annual theme, which is Recovering Europe. But thanks to fortuitous timing, both our first session of the academic year in September and this last session of the year honed in on important elections that will help determine Europe's future. In September, it was Germany. Today, we look at France. Thanks to support from our partners at universities throughout the US through our Jean Monnet and the USA network, and with special thanks to our partners, Miami, Florida, Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence, the Florida International University, the EU Center at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida, the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Institute of Technology. And thank you to our partners here at Pitt. Thanks in particular to my colleagues, Iris Matijevic and Kenny Riley in the background for their help during today's session and in organizing it. And to my colleague, Dr. JJ Spoon, who was originally scheduled to moderate today, but was unable to due to unfortunate scheduling conflict. She still graciously provided questions and reflections, which will shape today's panel and may be available to join us later in the session, at which point we may ask her for her thoughts as well. A couple of notes of housekeeping. I'm pleased to see so many people joining us. Please do feel free to add your questions. I will ask them of the participants and panelists. We want to hear from you, but do please submit those questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I won't be monitoring the chat, though my colleagues will, but if you can put your questions in Q&A, they're more likely to make it to their panelists. Speaking of which, today, I am pleased to welcome our panel of distinguished scholars to discuss the French elections. I will introduce each of our panelists in turn briefly to allow more time for conversation, but longer bios will be available on our website once we upload the video of this event as well. So first, let me introduce Philippe Marliere, a professor in French and European politics at University College London. Prior to UCL, he was awarded the Marcel Liebman Chair in Political Science by the Université Libre de Bruxelles. His research looks at French politics and political parties, most notably the French left, the Sarkozy presidency, citizenship, religion, and laïcité, French social movements, and France and the European Union. Dr. Marliere's books include La Mémoire socialiste, Sociologie du souvenir politique en milieu partisan by Larmatin in 2007, and La Gauche radicale en Europe with Jean-Numa Ducage and Louis Weber in 2013. He has also authored numerous articles and book chapters. Also joining us from California is Jean Beeman. She's an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Previously, she was faculty at Purdue University and held visiting fellowships at Duke University and the European University Institute in Florence. Dr. Beeman's research is ethnographic in nature and focuses on race, ethnicity, racism, international migration, and state violence in both France and the United States. She's the author of Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France by the University of California Press in 2017, as well as numerous articles and book chapters, including a 2021 article in Journal of Common Market Studies toward a reading of Black Lives Matter in France, and Francis Ahmed's and Muslim Others, the Entanglements of Racism and Islamophobia in French Cultural Studies that same year. Both of those articles have actually shaped our series this year. And then finally, last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Arthur Goldhammer, who is a local affiliate and seminar co-chair at the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. He received his PhD in mathematics from MIT and taught at Brandeis University and Boston University, but we didn't invite him here to crunch numbers. He's also an award-winning translator, having translated over 125 books from French, including Thomas Piketty's best-selling Capital in the 21st Century. And as a longtime observer of French politics, Dr. Goldhammer regularly comments on contemporary France on his blog site, French Politics, which is now on Tocqueville21.com, and I encourage you to look it up. He also writes frequently for the American Prospect, The Nation, Democracy Journal, and Foreign Policy. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. So where do we start? We're in the enviable position of being able to go both backwards and forwards. Because over 1 week ago, on April 10th, the first round of the presidential elections took place, and we have those results. But looking ahead to this weekend, we also want to try to forecast the results of the second round runoff election that will be held this Sunday, and what the implications are depending upon who wins that election. So to start, let's do the backward stuff. Let's look a little bit at the background of this election cycle. So I'm going to throw this to everyone, to the full panel, but I'll ask you to maybe speak in the order that I just introduced you. So Philippe first. But the big question is sort of what is the context in which these elections are taking place? And among the sort of issues we might address, or what are that might come up in that, is what are the issues that French voters really care about in that context? So Philippe, if you don't mind getting us started.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Alison and the European Studies Center for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here for this discussion. Well, the context, I think, of course, the context always matters in an election. And the context in this election in France is quite particular because, of course, and that's something which applies to all countries in the world. We've just, I was about to say, we've seen the end of the pandemic. It's still not over, but I think we'd like to think that we've got the main aspects behind us, and of course that impacted very much on the political debate in France in general. In fact, there was very little public debate in the month prior to the election because of that. People couldn't gather together. There was no mass rallies. The French like mass rallies. They were only organized very lately, during the official campaign, i.e. a month before the vote. The context was also a term because one of the two candidates who qualify for the second round is the incumbent president, Emmanuel Macron. And it's very difficult to make an assessment of his presidency. Of course, it depends. Some people would say it's a sort of a glass which is half full, others will say it's a half empty, depends on. But one thing is for sure is that he probably didn't manage to sort of implement all the policies, the main policies he had in mind, notably pension reform, something which he will have to get back to if he is re-elected on Sunday. There were important social movements also taking place during his term. French presidency is 5 years long, and notably the so-called yellow vests, taking to the streets for over 2 years. And it was really down to the pandemic to put an end to it. People couldn't go out during the pandemic. There were laws restricting mass gatherings. So that was, in a nutshell, if you like, the context of a weird election leading to a vote where, on the face of it, it seems like a bit déjà vu, more of the same, because the two candidates which made it to the second round are the same as 5 years ago. The third candidate, although he was fourth last time round from the radical left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, was also very close. And I think this is something I'd like to stress because he was defeated by Le Pen by a whisker. 400,000 votes separate Le Pen from Mélenchon. And if you think that the French voters, not everyone voted, but over 40 million in all, I think it's very little, very, very few votes, in fact. And it was a weird campaign, I would say, also in a sense that in response to your question about what were the themes which dominated the campaign, very hard to really pinpoint the themes. Of course, the so-called pouvoir d'achat, purchasing power, I don't know if it translates well into English, people being worried about, having paid the bills, what's left, to spend on yourself, for the kids, for the holidays, for education, for leisure, all this sort of thing. Yes, it really was the major issue. And I think Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate who qualified for the second round, was very astute using that theme. And that enabled her, in fact, to sort of skip, if you like, traditional far-right themes, which she still adheres to, on immigration, Islam, national values, and so on and so forth. So this is a weak campaign. And of course, Ukraine came up also, finally. You had for the sort of the launch of the campaign, the official campaign, coincided with the beginning of the war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And that boosted Macron in the polls. The ratings were boosted for a while. He went down after that. So a bit of not of it on the face of it, something which is déjà vu, but in reality, the sort of tectonic plates, keep moving in a direction of, and will leave it there for the time being. I don't want to keep the floor for too long, but I think they keep moving in a sense of the realignment of French politics, because, and this is my final point now, the major outcome of this election, in my view, was the complete collapse of the two main parties which had dominated French political life for the past 40 years, i.e. on the center-left, the Socialist Party, on the center-right, Les Républicains, which is the main conservative party.
Yeah, all great points. Jean, I wonder where you would pick up from that and thinking about the context.
Yes, thank you. So first, thank you, Alison, JJ, and the European Studies Center for this invitation. And I'm really honored to be in conversation with my esteemed colleagues whose work I followed for many years. So yeah, I would pick up on a lot of what Philippe said. I will say in my sort of vantage point as a sociologist that, presidential elections are always a sort of referendum on national identity, whether it's Germany, the United States, or France. So of course we cannot sort of, ignore the social context, the social issues that play into this discussion, which as a sociologist who studies race and immigration, this is really important to me. So in that sense, I would, kind of echo one thing that Philippe said around sort of thinking seriously about the fracturing of the left in France as that being a important thing that I hope we can come back to. The other thing I want to sort of highlight here as a sort of background is also thinking about the implications, well, I guess 2 points. The implications for, will France re-elect an incumbent, the first time in 20 years or so, and what does that mean? So it's also a referendum on Macron and how people think about him, which again, I think Philippe's point about COVID-19 is really important, because of course that's shaping the context in which all of these discussions are occurring. And the other thing I want to say really briefly, is just a way of introduction, is to think seriously about the ways in which, particularly over the last 5 years, over Macron's presidency, there's been a sort of mainstreaming of far-right discourse and far-right ideas, whether they're about, immigration, Islam, the presence of Muslims, racism. You can think about Macron's argument against wokeism and the sort of importation of US ideas. And so I think that, beyond sort of thinking about the specific sort of candidates, we should also think about the ways that the sort of discourse of someone like Marine Le Pen has become much more normalized than it was previously.
Thank you. More great points. And Art, what would you pick up on?
Well, first of all, let me echo my co-panelists' thanks to the organizers for including me in this discussion. I think Philippe is quite right to point out that we seem to be nearing the end of the pandemic, which returns politics to a kind of normality that it hasn't had for a long time. COVID was one of the two things that interrupted Macron's reform program, the other being the Gilets jaunes uprising, which we will come to later, I'm sure. On the other hand, the war in Ukraine, which Philippe also mentioned, puts this context in a light of complete abnormality. The implications for Europe of this war have lent a new seriousness to this election. They did give Macron a temporary boost, but it's been only temporary. It's begun to fade, although in the last few days, it seems that Macron is making a bit of a comeback. The outcome of this election is very much in doubt, which was certainly not the case in 2017, when all commentators were confident that Macron was going to win, despite the challenge from the Rassemblement National, which has been improving its score in each new election cycle since Marine Le Pen took over. The second point about this context is, as Philippe also mentioned, the crumbling of the traditional mainstream parties in France. But beyond that, I would say parties more generally have faded from view and been replaced by charismatic figures. This applies both to Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Marine Le Pen, who has a party behind her, nevertheless distanced herself from that party. She resigned the presidency, turned it over to a young colleague. Many of her posters abandoned the name Le Pen and simply say Marine for president because she wants to dissociate herself from the Le Pen name. That's part of her strategy for normalizing herself. On the left, Mélenchon too has made very little of the party that's behind him, La France Insoumise, and is really running as a charismatic character who depends on his own eloquent rhetoric to reach the masses. Macron himself is a kind of centrist populist who came out of nowhere and through his appeal to the media launched himself into French public life where he had never held elective office before and immediately leapt to the forefront and became a candidate for the presidency. Now he's in the unfortunate position of having inherited the mantle of both the center-right and center-left, the two forces against which he ran in 2017. He now has to defend a record, which he did not have to do in 2017. And that record has alienated him from a part of the French electorate, along with his personality and his background. He represents the administrative bureaucratic class, the well-educated, those who owe their secure positions in French life to their having attended elite educational institutions. And those people have attracted a good deal of resentment in the past, not only during Macron's presidency, but well before that. Unfortunately, he's reaped all of that resentment and has to defend himself against it. So I'd say those things characterize the context in which we find ourselves now.
Yeah, thank you. You all brought up such great points. And we've now raised enough really interesting points. There's a number of directions I can go. So let me encourage the audience as well to start submitting questions that that they're interested in so that can help shape our discussion. But I want to pick up on a couple of things that have come up. I too have been struck by this sort of the personalities forming these parties or the personalities behind the parties. And so I'm kind of curious, as opposed to these traditional parties that we've been more used to. And as a personal note, thinking back, I was in France in 2002 when Jean-Marie Le Pen made the second round. And I remember this sort of every conversation that I had, and this may speak more to who my friends were at the time, and I don't think so, but every conversation I had was the sort of like, oh, the shame, we're so embarrassed, like, I can't believe it, we have to do everything we can to defeat him. And I get the sense that that's not necessarily the mood I would hear everywhere in France, but could you speak a little to that? Like, how has Marine Le Pen kind of rebranded herself and her party, and what does that exist now, or is there just more mainstream people are okay with it?
I think it's a very good question and a good point to make at this stage, because starting with Jean's point about the mainstreaming of far-right discourse in France, I think that's a very important point to explain why yet again 5 years after the second participation of the far right in a second round, we've got yet again the far right sort of very close to seizing power, or at least the French presidency. It's a point which I think has to do, and I think probably it would be helpful to say that, because you were referring to 2002. That was the first time ever in the Fifth Republic, which started in 1958, de Gaulle's Republic, that a far-right candidate had made it to the second round. It was then Jean-Marie Le Pen, facing the incumbent president Jacques Chirac. Le Pen's father was trounced at the time. You know, the second round was 81% against 19%. And Le Pen made no gains virtually between the two rounds. You know, the 18 or the 16% he got in the first round, you know, he managed to grab another 3 points. It was then presented, if you like, as a kind of political freakery, you know, kind of one-off accident. It will never happen again, you know, this sort of thing. It's because left-wing voters hadn't gone out en masse to vote for the socialist candidate, who was then Lionel Jospin. That was the way it was presented. Another anecdote was, at the time, I don't know if you were in Paris, you probably saw it, there was a massive demo in the streets of Paris. 1 million took to the streets to really say, you know, left and right voters all together, what the French call the Republican Front, which is a sort of a kind of sacred alliance, which never happens in politics, except when there's a sort of threat of the far right, you know, getting very close to power. So 1 million took to the street, and the cry was, the call was, let's stop fascism. That was the way it was presented then. 2017, 5 years ago, Marine Le Pen, the daughter this time, made it to the second round. A bit of outcry, far less. No Republican front this time, at least political parties were less clear about it. And a number of voters, particularly on the left, decided to abstain much more than in 2002, or even vote for Le Pen. That's something probably we might have to discuss at some point. How come particular Mélenchon's supporters could cast their vote for the far right? So, and the result was still a comfortable result for Macron, and victory, you know, 66% against 34, but less, you know, not the trouncing of 2002. And here, you know, we expect a very close contest. You know, as Art said, you know, it will be very close. I will still put my money, although it's not a political science thing to do, to put money on Macron to win again, but I think he should win. But a major blunder between now and Sunday, particularly tonight, there's a televised debate between the two candidates. It should be extremely appalling bad, probably, for Le Pen to turn things around. But anyway, the contest will be close. The contest will be close, and it shows that yes, there is a lot of mainstreaming of the far right, its discourse, its ideas, but also a kind of banalization of far right leaders and candidates. Le Pen comes across as, for some, not everyone, of course, as a kind of moderate candidate. You know, never ever before the French would have thought of Jean-Marie Le Pen, her father, as a moderate guy. And of course, she worked very hard on sort of putting a sort of smoother facade face. You know, she loves cats. She's given lots of interviews to sort of newspapers, inviting them at her home, all this kind of stuff. Despite, you know, if you study our main policies, they haven't changed. It's still, you know, the sort of far-right policies of old. So this is very interesting to see how progressively, and the last point is that, you know, it would have been a surprise that Le Pen didn't make it to the second round. It was expected, I would say, months, if not years before that election. So you see how from between 2002 and 2022, how things have changed. You know, sort of mainstreaming, banalization of the far right, no more Republican front, no more big demos in Paris to stop fascism. It's become, I wouldn't say that Le Pen and the Rassemblement National are seen as normal mainstream parties, but I think they're certainly on course to be seen by some voters as, you know, no more dangerous than, say, Macron. That's really part of the problem of Macron now.
If I may, I'd like to add 2 points to what Philippe just said. The banalization of the far right has been aided by the fact that the far right has taken power in a number of countries in Europe. It's been in power in Italy, in Hungary, in Poland, and elsewhere, and not to mention the United States. Donald Trump certainly did a great deal to normalize the idea that an extreme candidate could take power and could govern in an advanced democratic state. So that has helped. Marine Le Pen was also outflanked on her right by Eric Zemmour, who has not yet been mentioned. Eric Zemmour ran a campaign so radical, so hostile to foreigners and Muslims that helped Le Pen to make herself look more moderate than she would have looked otherwise. So I think with just those 2 brief points, I just want to add that to what Philippe so eloquently laid out for us.
Yeah, excellent. And Jean, I think you probably have something you want to say.
Yeah, I was actually going to make the point about Eric Zemmour as well. So I'm really glad that's part of the conversation. And I also just completely agree with both my panelists articulated. The one thing I also want to raise, particularly in thinking about the contrast between her father and her, is the gender question. I mean, I think so. Philippe mentioned the cat issue, which I think is just continually hilarious. But like, I think there is a really, I mean, I think that's a big part of like her sort of seeming more approachable, more relatable, being this cat lady. And so I think we have to also think about the role of gender. And, you know, even though as Philippe says, her actual platform hasn't changed, she has the capacity to be seen as more approachable, more mainstream. And that's helped her as well, which in a way that I think was not at all accessible to her father.
Yeah. One more point is that although parts of her platform have not changed, I think her economic approach has changed. In 2017, she ran on essentially a Frexit platform. Her proposal for the French economy was to abandon the euro, leave the European Union, and those were not popular measures. But now, having realized that she's become the leading working class party in France, she gets more working class votes than any other party, including the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. She's run on the cost of living, purchasing power, as Philippe pointed out, and on protecting French workers. This is very popular among her base, less so among those on the far right who supported Eric Zemmour, who, when he first announced, took about half of Le Pen's votes. Eventually, because of the war in Ukraine, where Zemmour refused to denounce his support for Putin and refused to accept Ukrainian refugees, both of those points she differed from Marine Le Pen, some of those votes returned to her. But the votes that he took away from her were the bourgeois nationalists, the more well-to-do, older Le Pen voters who were not so comfortable being in alliance with the working class base that Le Pen now represents. So in that respect, her party is her base is a different base from the one that supported Jean-Marie Le Pen. And she's also aided by the fact that the Le Pen brand name, even though she's distanced herself from it to some extent, stands for all those things, hostility to Islam, hostility to immigration, and so on. So she no longer has to emphasize those issues. It's like Scotch tape no longer has to emphasize that it sticks things together. Everybody knows that. And everybody knows that Le Pen stands for the same things her father did. She doesn't have to make that clear. And people who are attracted to that racist side of her vote forgive her for not saying it because they know that it's part of a strategy.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly jump in on that. I mean, I wish I could remember where I saw the clip, but in one of her sort of, interactions with a potential voter, the person was complaining about how immigrants are taking all our jobs. And she's like, yes, they are, but also let's focus on the economy. And I think that gets exactly to Author's point that she's been very strategic and framing this not against a sort of immigration related platform, but also sort of framing this around an economic platform that makes it so mainstream people can accept her, can vote for her as well.
Yes. I agree with both panelists here and colleagues. a point also about, we've talked so far about the mainstreaming and normalization of the far-right discourse and ideas, but I think let's look now at the electoral gains of the far-right, because now there were 3 far-right candidates, another candidate called Dupont-Aignan, who I think got something like 2 or 3% of the share of the vote. If you put together with Zemmour on 7% and Le Pen on 24%, altogether, the total far-right votes is now 32, 33%, compared to 31% for the 6 left-wing candidates altogether. That includes Mélenchon, the main one, but you had another 5 candidates representing the left, you know, from the Greens, Social Democrat, and 2 Trotskyist candidates, extreme left. So altogether, the total left is inferior to the 3 far-right candidates. That is something, really, in a country such as France, to have a far-right which electorally now weighs more than the total left. You know, the left in those presidential elections in the past was never the majority side, you know, always winning when winning, and the left didn't win many presidential elections, François Mitterrand twice, François Hollande once. They were always in the minority in the first round, but yet they managed in the second round to rally enough centrist voters to get elected, you know, by a short margin, 51, 52, 54%. It shows also 2 things. Well, the far right is sort of going up, and the left is really, it's a very bad election again. I think a lot of people in France on the left, notably, would like to think there is hope now. There is light at the end of the tunnel with Mélenchon's good performance. Yes, it's a good performance, but at what price? You know, behind Mélenchon, there's no one. And as we know, Mélenchon hasn't managed, has failed, in my view, to gather together all traditions of the left. He's a very polarizing figure. He's got qualities, but he's also a polarizing figure. So it shows one thing, you know, political scientists in France have been talking for 40 years now about the so-called glass ceiling for the far right. There would be allegedly a kind of glass ceiling, you know, when you reach it, you can't go beyond that glass ceiling. So I remember as a student back in the 1980s, I was a long time ago studying political science in a French university. The glass ceiling was 15%, then it became 20%. And now we are, you know, almost in the mid-30s. And those figures now show that there's a vote reserve for any far-right candidate making it to the second round, you know, starting from 32%, because Zemmour and Dupont-Aignan's vote are going to go en masse for Le Pen. If you now, the whole thing is going to be between now and Sunday are going to be about undecided voters. How are they going to vote? Abstention and tactical voting on the part of voters who profoundly dislike Macron is going to be key, because if you have a lot of left-wing voters abstain, or if some of them, or centrist voters, because they dislike Macron for some reason, do not vote for Le Pen, again, that could make a difference. And I think this is really why we are on uncharted territories. We've never been there, although I still think Macron will prevail in the end. But, you know, again, if you look back, the progression of the far right in electoral terms is staggering.
So I guess I want to stay with that for a minute and ask a question that came from a colleague of mine, which was, as you look at like Zemmour and Le Pen and how they positioned themselves vis-a-vis each other, and then how their rhetoric in terms of immigration, the question was, you know, is the rhetoric that's winning anti-immigration, or is it more explicitly Islamophobic? You know what I mean? Is it immigration in general that the discussion is about, or is it really targeted at Islamic immigrant or Muslim immigrants?
I think it's hard to separate. I think one event that made a major impact on the French consciousness was the murder of Samuel Paty. There had been he's a school teacher who was beheaded in broad daylight on a public street in front of his school for having taken up in his class the question of the cartoons caricaturing Muhammad that were published in Charlie Hebdo, which led to the massacre of the staff of Charlie Hebdo. So I think the nature of this crime, the shocking brutality of it, and it was not so long ago, only in 2020, I think that really left a stamp on French consciousness, as did the fact that the trial of one of the surviving terrorists from the attacks in 2015 is going on at this moment during the election campaign. So those things raised to a level of consciousness, I think, the issue of the place of Islam in French society and just what should be done about it. Macron himself has taken measures which were criticized, particularly on the left, for being Islamophobic. He imposed new restrictions on Muslim religious schooling. Teachers had to be trained in France from now on, instead of in countries like Saudi Arabia, where it was alleged they had imbibed the foreign ideologies that became breeding grounds for terrorism. He authorized the police to conduct searches under less restrictive rules than in the past. Some of his ministers went even farther, criticizing the sale of halal and kosher foods in grocery stores. That was his Minister of the Interior, Gerald Darmanin. And yet, despite those measures, which were criticized on the left as Islamophobic, polls showed that 70% of the French public felt that Macron had not gone far enough in enforcing these measures against Islam. His own minister, Darmanin, the minister I mentioned a moment ago, accused Le Pen of having gone soft on Islam. So I think all of those things combine to show that there's a deep anxiety in the French electorate, and that Macron, who is often accused of being democratic and not listening to the voices of the people, on this issue perhaps listened a little too closely to the voice of the people who are urging him to crack down on Islam. And he went further than I think he should have gone, but not far enough for, alas, a majority of the French.
So there must be a portion of the voters, though, that are immigrants or, you know, Muslim themselves. So where are they voting? What kind of options do they have?
A lot of them voted for Mélenchon.
Yes.
You see that if you look at the precinct by precinct results in Paris and its suburbs, the precincts where there is heavy Muslim representation, heavy immigrant or descendants of immigrants representation, they voted heavily for Mélenchon. So I think that was one of the few choices they felt were open to them. On the other hand, there are many Muslims living in France who are very well integrated into French society, and they vote like other Frenchmen of similar economic and social class. So you find a fair number of well-integrated Muslims voting in the center for Macron.
Yeah, I think if I could, please.
Yeah, no, I was about to throw it to you anyway, so.
Yeah, no, I think if I could just kind of weigh in a little bit on this. I mean, I think the question around sort of, is it immigration or is it Islamophobia? I think more than not it being difficult to separate it, I think it's actually like crucial that we don't separate it, in the sense that, you know, immigration is always framed as a social problem, and that sort of the discourse, as Arthur articulated, the policies are always based on who we imagine is doing the migration, right? And so in this sense, I think, you know, the sort of threat or quote unquote of Muslim immigrants is both a question, therefore, of, you know, immigration and how it's a social problem, and also a question of Islamophobia. The other thing I would say is that I think, you know, in thinking about specifically the question of voting, I mean, I think that's also just an open question for the second round, now that Mélenchon is not a candidate, is not an option, right? I think, you know, are people voting for Macron or would they vote against Le Pen? I mean, I think that's part of the sort of question marks between now and Sunday.
And I guess while I have you, can you talk a little bit about the response to specific Le Pen proposals, like not providing social services to immigrants, the banning of headscarves and face coverings, and how that's going over in different segments of society?
Yeah, I mean, I think Arthur kind of started us off on this question of thinking about the ways that there's a, it's not just Le Pen creating these ideas. It's actually, there's a lot of reception for these ideas, particularly in the aftermath of the massacre of Samuel Paty and other, Islamic terrorist attacks in, the last decade or so, right? There is very much a sense of, everything being given to immigrants or foreigners and not to, native French people. And so that's both a discourse that, Le Pen is putting forth, but it's also, I think, really important to keep in mind, again, as I was trying to say earlier, how these ideas are so mainstream that you don't actually need Le Pen to be the one who's articulating that. And so that really just, once we sort of think about it in that way, that really opens up a conversation, or should open up a conversation, about how French society has changed, particularly since, Jean-Marie Le Pen, as Philippe noted earlier.
I think it's also interesting that in these final days, when both candidates have to appeal to the Mélenchon voters,
right?
Marine Le Pen has backed off a bit on her headscarf ban. She's said that we need to reconsider that. Perhaps it's certainly not going to be at the top of my priority list, is what she actually said.
Yes, a point about Zemmour, if you like. I think it's interesting to note that Zemmour is the byproduct of at least 40 years of endless debates, if not culture wars, revolving around Islam in France. Right. And with all the subplots to laïcité, Republican values, nothing to do with the grand old party in the US, but the Republican values of the French Republic. And I think it started 40 years ago, because before that, I think it started off when the sort of second generation migrants born in France started, to become, to play a part, and rightly so, in French society. They are French citizens born in France. If you're born on French soil of French or foreign parents, you get French nationality when you reach the age of 18. So the whole debate started then 40 years ago, with a very weak far right. But of course, the problem, and that's something, I think something you could say about Macron today, is that mainstream parties on the left and on the right have used that so-called political football to make electoral gains, if you like, by sort of constructing an alleged Islamic threat in French society. Started off in the late 1980s with the vexed question of the hijab. We're still there. We've made no progress. And you pointed out, Alison, that it's part of Le Pen's. It's one of the very controversial measures of Marine Le Pen's, anti-constitutional, totally liberal, illegal. She would have to change a number of basic laws to implement that. It's of course a measure which completely discriminates against a category of the population. It goes against French laïcité. The trouble is, and you can see Macron making lots of noise around this issue, saying it's illiberal, I would never do that. The trouble is, it's something Art said earlier, some members of his own government during the past 5 years have made points in debate which were fairly similar to that. So I think this is, again, the mainstream of French politics using Islam as a political football for political gains. And that started a long time ago, not 5 years ago. And then realizing, and of course, all that has had the effect of normalizing, legitimizing the far right, because, if mainstream parties, sort of use that type of discourse and ideas in a mainstream, it means that in the end, maybe Le Pen is right on that. So it's in a sense easy now for Le Pen to come up with all these ideas. And Zemmour, who is Zemmour? I think Zemmour is a Le Pen who is a sort of without inhibition of Le Pen. Le Pen's strategy has been over the past 10 years also to try to de-demonize herself and her party. She doesn't want to be seen as far right. She really resents people, journalists notably, calling her far right. She even threatened to sue a journalist one day because she had been called a far right politician, and she lost, of course, before the court. So we can call her far right. And Zemmour was the opposite. He's not a politician. In a sense, he's a kind of, I think he's probably the closest in French politics you can get of a Trump, because he comes from outside of politics. He's not a businessman like Trump initially, but he's a media pundit. And he was given a platform on various French media, some very mainstream, like the radio broadcast RTL, for instance, million listeners. It's a major broadcaster. And more recently, CNews. CNews is a TV news channel, 24 hours a day, owned by French billionaire Bolloré, who really has a very right-wing agenda, who fell out with Macron. They were pally, now he fell out. So he's in, for trying to get revenge on him, and also pushing very reactionaries, family values. He's a traditional Catholic. So he found in Zemmour, if you like, someone which could sort of carry out this sort of agenda. And that's what he did. He was given a platform unopposed for months to spout literally his racism. Zemmour was condemned twice for incitement to racial hatred. So that's really something that someone who was twice condemned for incitement to racial hatred could have gone as high as 15% in the polls at some point in this campaign. He's taken seriously. He's not a politician, and he had nothing to lose. So his task was to be outrightly racist, polarizing, and of course, and that helped, of course, as my colleague said already, that helped tremendously Le Pen, because of course she shares those views, but she didn't have to sort of repeat what Zemmour did the dirty work, so to speak, for her. She could concentrate on socioeconomic issues. And that's why now she is in a sort of driving position on the far right, possibly will get elected. I think not, but possibly could get elected. But of course, she has a daunting task if elected, because, I mean, just the last point about the program, you could summarize it in one word or two words. It's called national preference or national priority. That's how it was relabeled recently. National priority means that if elected, Le Pen's presidency would implement a series of policies which would directly discriminate against non-nationals in terms of social security, subsidies, anything you could, places in a nursery, in schools, jobs, housing. Her thing would be French first, would be served first. It is anti-constitutional as we speak. She can't, if you do that, and Rassemblement National, town halls, municipalities tried to do that in the past when they were elected. When they were, the thing was brought to justice, they lost. It's illegal to do that. So this is the core of a program. So that's why I think I would clearly label a program far right.
One footnote to what Philippe has just said on the relation between Le Pen and Zemmour. Le Pen has a niece named Marion Maréchal. She used to call herself Marion Maréchal Le Pen. She dropped the Le Pen name, but remained closer to her grandfather, Jean-Marie Le Pen, than Marine did. Marine split with her father quite notoriously several years ago. Well, in the past, Marion Maréchal was a member of the Rassemblement National, the party of Marine Le Pen. She was elected a deputy on that ticket. But this year, she abandoned Marie Le Pen and threw her support to Zemmour. That was the high point of Zemmour's campaign. He featured their embrace at one of his meetings in a televised rally that went out to all of France. And then Marine Le Pen was shown on television reacting to this, saying that this abandonment by her niece hurt her deeply. She was almost in tears, visibly on television. This was one of the things that served to humanize her, and at the same time to distance her from the still more radical right, led by Zemmour. So it made people believe there really has been a transformation within the Le Pen family, a deep split, and Marion Maréchal has gone over to the other side. One further point on that relationship, Marion Maréchal is a practicing Catholic. Religion is important in her life in a way that it is not in Marine Le Pen's life. Marine Le Pen has no religious component whatsoever. So the Catholic support for Zemmour is an important component of that aspect of the far right. It's not so important in the Le Pen aspect, since that Le Pen's party has now become a working class party, and the French working class has not been deeply connected to Catholicism for more than a century. So that's just a footnote to what Philippe has just said.
Very briefly, even more briefly than what you just said, Art, is what is very striking is that today Zemmour's electorate resembles very much Jean-Marie Le Pen's electorate back in the 1980s, early 1980s, i.e. Middle-class bourgeois living in cities. You know, if you look at the 16th arrondissement in Paris, the wealthiest in Paris, this is where Zemmour gets his highest score in France. You know, it's really going back to what the Front National was 40 years ago, and is no longer with Marine Le Pen. With Marine Le Pen, it's a more working class, not entirely working class, but more working class party.
So I'm now very concerned about the Le Pen next family gathering, because I imagine it's going to be very awkward. But we've gotten a number of questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that I address them and try to weave them together with some of the other things that I know we still want to talk about. But a number of the questions that are coming up, I think I can kind of lump together in that people are curious about France's position vis-a-vis other supranational and international organizations, regardless of the outcome. So whether Le Pen or Macron wins. So we have questions about if Le Pen wins, will there be more isolationist parties? What is the future of France's role in NATO? I think obviously there's also the what is the future of France's role in the EU, given some of her past politics. And then, you know, someone has asked about Macron's advocacy of stronger borders, which seems like maybe it is pushing back a little bit on integration and Schengen. So sort of, if we could speak to the positioning of these two candidates and the potential for what that means about France's position within Europe and within these international organizations.
Well, Le Pen wants to withdraw from NATO, which would be a serious blow to European efforts to sustain Ukraine in the war with Russia. Le Pen is known to be hostile to the EU, although she's moderated her position compared to the, frankly, Frexit position that she took in 2017. Macron is deeply committed to the European Union. France is right now holds the rotating presidency of the European Union. Macron had hoped to make that a kind of launching pad for his presidential campaign. Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine intervened, so he had to turn his efforts from reforming the EU toward trying to head off the invasion of Ukraine. He became the chief European negotiator with Putin for a time, but they're diametrically opposed on their relations to these international organizations.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, on foreign affairs, I agree with Art. I think there would be massive differences if it were a Marine Le Pen presidency as opposed to Macron's being re-elected. He mentioned NATO. That would be a very big difference, particularly at this time with the war in Ukraine. And by the way, let's note that leaving NATO, the higher commandment of NATO at the very least, seems to be a popular idea among the main contenders. You know, both left and right. For instance, if you look at Mélenchon, he says, you know, about the same. So I think, and both before the war in Ukraine and Zemmour, so Le Pen, Zemmour, Mélenchon, and other smaller candidates, far left as well, were in that kind of, you know, just before the start of the war, you know, it's all the fault of NATO and the US imperialism, you know, blah, 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 the usual stuff. And of course, they were proved wrong, and they all had really to backpedal in haste. And I think the one who was probably the best at doing that, it was Le Pen, although I think she's, of all candidates, in reality, she is probably the closest to the Russian regime and Putin, whom she met on a number of occasions. She also had this controversial loan from a very controversial bank linked to Putin himself, Russian bank, that is. So a lot of things which I think tonight in the TV debate, probably Macron was raised to sort of, because of course that's suddenly less popular to be seen as pro-Russian. But it's a very interesting thing. And why are so many candidates so pro-Russian, at least before the war, less so now? I think it's got to do with this revival of a kind of French nationalism, and that goes also very much with this idea that the EU is a kind of a almost totalitarian club in which, you know, France has lost its sovereignty. Well, I think we've seen that in the country where I live, the UK, with Brexit. Those candidates have toned down their Frexit noise, but it's because of Brexit. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure they would still be at it. So I think it's really the revival, that's the way I would explain it, the revival of this idea that, you know, France shouldn't be subjected to any bloc, let alone any imperialism, you know, the US one notably. So always an attempt to be autonomous, that's what Mélenchon says, and non-aligned, that's also what he says. And I think surprisingly, it's quite fascinating to see that on those issues in foreign affairs, the far right and the radical left seem to really go along pretty well, you know, at least on what should be done. So yes, it would be, I think, massive difference between if we had a Le Pen presidency when it comes to foreign affairs.
We have another question from our audience that goes more specifically to some of Marine Le Pen's policies regarding the economy and her talk about reducing taxes on the young and many other groups. And the question is, what sorts of services or programs does she say she'll reduce or eliminate to pay for such a tax cut? It's kind of a specific question, but does anybody want to?
Well, she hasn't said how she's going to pay for these policies. That's an issue that will come up in the debate tonight, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that debate in just a second. I wanted to think about, back in the discussion when we started, Philippe brought up a lot of the rallies that I saw, you know, in 2002, and the big mass demonstrations. And when I think, that made me think about some more recent mass demonstrations even within the context of COVID or just before COVID. So I wanted to kind of go back to that a little bit and see how some of those issues that I know have brought people to the streets have influenced the election, or are they not being things people are voting on? So, I mean, when the first one, I guess, is come up already is the Gilets jaunes and the protests of the yellow vests. And so I guess my first question is, who were the yellow vest protesters voting for? Who was getting those votes?
Well, the yellow vest protest broke out in response to a very small increase in the gasoline tax. And the people seen as responsible for it were people who drove long distances to work, that had a long commute. And so their ability to pay their bills at the end of the month was affected, or so they claimed, by this small increase in the gas tax. But the demonstration soon morphed into something much larger and more nebulous than a protest against any specific tax. It's a protest against the way France was ruled, and particularly the way France was ruled under Macron. Macron, as I said earlier, was seen as the very embodiment of this administrative elite, trained in France's top schools, which essentially is the source of most legislation under the French system, because under the presidential system that exists in France, the parliament is relatively weak. So policy is made by the executive and by the ministries, where these top bureaucrats provide continuity from administration to administration. The two parties of former parties of the mainstream, the center-right and center-left parties, the descendants of the Gaullists on the right side and the socialists on the left side, had more or less converged in their approach to governing France over the past 20 years, to the point where policies opposed by one party when it was out of power would be enacted by that same party when it came into power. Retirement reform, pension reform is one of those issues where both parties made reforms that were seen as necessary to keep the pension system viable financially. Now, there are likely to be, if Macron is reelected and goes through with his pension reform policy, raising the legal age of retirement to 65, being one of the components of that policy, although he's somewhat backed off on that in recent weeks in an effort to secure the votes he needs to get reelected. If he goes through with that reform, you'll probably see massive protests yet again, as you saw in 1995 and during Sarkozy's presidency and so on. These pension reforms are very unpopular in France. But do those protests against pension reform really account for the depth of hatred that you see manifested against Macron? It's really hard to believe that, because if you look around Europe, France is the only country that has a retirement age as low as 62, which it is now. Germany is 67. Most of the other countries are 65. The United States is 65. So whatever you think of Macron's pension reforms in general, they're more or less in line with what other countries are doing. And the argument that this may be necessary in order to keep France's generous welfare state afloat financially are not without merit. So to me, the big puzzle of this election is why hatred of Macron has reached the point that it has. I think that was one thing that you saw manifested in the Gilets jaunes protests. Certainly, the police response to those protests was severe in some cases. Quite a number of people were injured. And police brutality is one of the things that Macron is charged with having failed to prevent or having instigated himself. I don't know if that's a fair charge. It's one of the things that's held against him. But to my mind, the French have always had a penchant to dislike their leaders intensely, at least until they're dead. Once they're dead, I mean, Chirac and de Gaulle were both hated when they were in office by large numbers of French, but are now revered as great statesmen. So perhaps such a fate will befall Macron. But for the moment, I think the intense hatred of him, which is the only thing that can account for the collapse of the Republican front, is really a mystery to me.
Interesting. It's an interesting way to frame it and to think about. But you brought up something else, this issue of police brutality, because that makes me think of another set of demonstrations and protests that we've seen. The French do love to protest, but particularly in the wave of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests that were happening throughout the summer of 2020 in the United States, we saw protests in France and around Black Lives Matter, some of which started kind of about what was happening in the United States, but they've definitely morphed into things that are very germane to what is happening in France. So Jean, I wonder if you could speak a little bit, given your research, to what role the sort of race and racism and Black Lives Matter movement and issues of police brutality have played in this election.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently writing a book on the state of anti-racism in France, and particularly thinking about the growing problem of police violence and the opposition to it. And so I think, as you mentioned, the events of 2020, I think you saw, not just in France, but throughout Europe and throughout the rest of the world, sort of related anti-racist protests and demonstrations, oftentimes, as in the case of France, in violation of COVID-19 related restrictions. But I think it's also really helpful, really important to keep in mind that these protests are also just part of a sort of newer version or more recent version of a long-standing anti-racist struggle, particularly in France. So there's been, a lot of conversation about the growing problem of police violence in France. So thinking about, for example, the death of Adama Traoré in 2016, and how his sister Assa Traoré has risen to prominence as an anti-racist activist, both within France, but also gotten a lot of attention here in the United States, and the ways that activists are sort of thinking about what's happening here in the United States in terms of incidents of police violence, including George Floyd, but even before George Floyd, we can think about other the death of Michael Brown in 2014, for example, and the ways that those their sort of attention to those incidents in conversation with how they think about their ongoing anti-racist struggles. And so I think that's also another way of thinking about, or that's interesting to think about, the role of the yellow vest and sort of, in some ways making the issue of police brutality much more visible, even though it had been a long problem in some of these communities, some of these Black and non-urban communities beforehand, but there's a sort of visibility that the, Gilets Jaunes protests provided to a general mainstream public. The other thing I would say is that I think this also was part of it. This also kind of, I think, gets a little bit to what Arthur was saying about the intense hatred of Macron, is also thinking about the kind of conversation that's happening across Europe around sort of recognizing or acknowledging Europe's colonial and imperial past, right? So thinking about different, statues that are demolished in the UK, which I'm sure Philippe can speak to, but also thinking about the sort of vandalization of the statue of Colbert in Paris, him being one of the authors of the Code Noir, right? And so there also is a particular, we're in a particular moment where, particular racialized communities in France are really forcing France to confront its own history, its own legacy of racism and imperialism, and not just sort of relegate these questions to being a US phenomenon, right? So like Black Lives Matter, of course, is a movement that started in the United States, but there also is a particular longstanding history of, what we call in the United States, anti-Black violence in France. And I think activists are really trying to get the state to pay attention to.
Is it working? Are they? Sorry, I was just wondering. Are people actually addressing it in their public, speeches? Is it going to come up in the debate tonight?
Yeah, I don't know if it'll come up in the debate tonight. I mean, I think as I tried to allude to earlier, I mean, I think it's been interesting to follow Macron's own words about this in the last year or so, where he actually has been very explicit about denouncing these questions of sort of, colonialism or racism or white supremacy as US imported questions. So I think that in some respects, I think because of the international, including US attention that activists such as Assa Traoré or Kaya Diallo have received, that's forced people like Macron to say, okay, wait a second, this actually isn't a French issue. They're just too influenced by US phenomena, US debates. And so I think that you're seeing the response in that respect as well.
Philippe, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It's all right, Alison. Just a quick point about police brutality. I think it's become a political issue of late, not simply in the media, which are now covering them, but also in the political debates. And that's pretty new. I think probably it's something which really cropped up some years ago, 5 to 10 years ago. And I think the reason for that is the French police historically has always been heavy-handed and quite brutal, to be fair. There's nothing new there. What is probably new is that until 5 to 10 years ago, police brutality was essentially exercised in the suburbs, deprived areas of big cities, in working class and against racialized populations. And that's really why there was so little, if no coverage at all. But when police brutality started to get exercised against white people, middle class, demonstrating in city centers, and the yellow vests are not middle classes, but most of them are white, that became an issue. I think that's a way to explain why suddenly something which is in fact very old and very ingrained in French police, which I think by European standards, I think the French police would be, we have here an American audience, would tends to behave very much like the sort of standard American cop rather than a British one, if you see what I mean. There's a lot of brutality involved, particularly if you're a racialized person. The point about social movement, I think an interesting point is to say that the weaker political parties and trade unions are, and they are indeed very weak today, both political parties and unions, the more buoyant those social movements, such as the Yellow Vests, seem to be. So there are lots of colleagues in France, you know, sociologists, political scientists, who write articles saying, well, that's a sign of a very healthy democracy. You know, people take to the street, protest in the best French tradition. I agree with that, but up to a point. I think it may be also the sign, you know, given that parties and unions are on the way, the sign of that, you know, that's the only way for people to be heard, you know, take to the street with all the sometimes violence, clashes with the police. And in the end, lots of confusion, because for me, you know, we've been talking about the Yellow Vest, but there are multiple movements in France going on all the time against the so-called immunity pass. You know, there were lots of demonstrations, anti-vax protesters, and to pinpoint the political allegiance of those movements is quasi impossible. You know, you may think that the Yellow Vest overall tended to lean to the left. It depends when and how and where. You know, there are, you know, areas, places and moments where you could say that, but at all the times, clearly, you had lots of stuff which was deeply reactionary. In the anti-immunity pass, you had lots of anti-Semitic placards and slogans. Bizarre, you know, and I think this is really a sign that parties, notably parties on the left, are less and less able to coordinate those forces. You know, traditionally, this should be, you know, there should be a voice who would be able, with unions, to coordinate those voices of the less of etc. They are unable to do that. That's why now you have more and more of that. And of course, it makes it very difficult for any power, left or right, to govern, because every time there's a reform being submitted and about to be passed by the National Assembly, people take to the street. And again, I'm not making a point against demonstrations. They are part of any democracy, and it should be defended. The right to demonstrate is a constitutional right, and I fully support that. But it's the way things are ongoing all the time, which makes it very difficult to work out. Politically, where do they vote, Yellow Vests? Very hard. I think their votes is very split, but I know that I've read a few things on the social media that significant numbers of them, well-known, well-established Yellow Vest so-called leaders, would be ready to cast their vote for Le Pen.
Yes, I would add one thing to that. Le Pen, although I think she has garnered the majority of the Yellow Vest vote, during the movement, she held herself relatively aloof. She did not say that she was an open supporter of the Yellow Vests. And that was a wise thing for her to do, because she was trying to moderate her image, show that she was presidential, and did not want to associate herself with a sometimes violent street movement. So that was a deliberate choice with her part, and I think it worked in her favor. It was one element of her image-changing strategy.
I have one more question kind of around the protests that have happened of late. And so Philippe, you brought up, thank you, the protests against sort of COVID restrictions and the immunity pass and policies there. And so I think we covered that, but I'm also curious about climate protesters. And we've seen significant protests around France lately. We know climate is an issue for people in general, although in the United States, you know, people can have climate as an issue, but not vote on it. Right. So I guess my question is where is the climate issue in current French elections? And why did we not see, I mean, Philippe, you mentioned that the Greens were kind of also, I mean, they, I guess, showed up, somebody ran. But, you know, they don't seem to have an agenda that resonates with voters the way it did in Germany, for example. So I wonder if you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think surprisingly, climate change and the environmental issues in general did not feature much in this election. And notably, the Greens and the Green candidate who got less than 5% of the share of the vote did not manage really to convince voters on that. He was quite notable on it. You know, he didn't really make the headlines with it. And I think there's a paradox here because all parties, probably with the exception of far-right candidates, talk a lot, or at least put in their program, lots of proposals about, in order to sort of address climate change. And they talk a lot about the environment. But I think when it comes to election, it's always surprising how little debate there is around those issues. You know, it seems that there's a discrepancy, a big gap between the sort of the intent, the programs, and it's all the more surprising that I think the environment was listed number 4 or 5 on the list of main concerns of the French. So it shows one thing. It shows that it's just, particularly for Green parties, it can't be one single issue. This, it's one issue among others, and it's surprising because the young, it's a very important issue, of course, for the young, 18-24-year-old bracket, and we know that the 18-24-year-old bracket is one which tends to abstain the most of all categories. So there's something going on there. Probably there's a lot of concern in the population, notably the young outside of elections, but it doesn't translate into votes, if you like, this sort of thing, particularly in France. I think in Germany, things are very different, for instance. But in France, probably, it's still in Europe, a kind of a country with a Southern mentality, probably, to sort of it's not a bit of a caricature, but Southern mentality meaning probably hasn't reached yet, although there are Green parties, there are, of course, people take an interest in the environment and climate change. But again, that's not a vote winner for sure.
I think, Alison, you're quite right to draw the parallel with Germany, the German Greens. Before the campaign started, there was an expectation that the French Greens might follow a similar course and become the leading party on the left with the collapse of the socialists. That did not happen, partly for internal reasons, because there was a bitter primary in the Green Party. And after Yannick Jadot was chosen as the candidate, Sandrine Rousseau, who finished second, started to criticize him openly and was eventually expelled from the party because of that criticism. So this presented a picture to the public of a party that had not yet matured to the point where leaders could put their differences aside and unite around a common program for the purposes of the election, as the Greens did, the Greens in Germany did, where you saw two-party leaders who had contested the leadership of the party then come together once one had been chosen and are now a triumvirate in the Schulz coalition. So the German Greens have been evolving in this direction toward becoming a party of government for 30 years, whereas the French Greens have not yet matured to the point where they've convinced a lot of people that they are ready to enter government.
Interesting. So we have, again, a number of questions, and we're kind of in our last 10 minutes, so I want to make sure we address them. And then leave a place, there's so much more we could talk about, but I would want to leave a place that we can at least let people go where you think we should go in the very end. So I'll leave it with a wide open one. But first, a couple of the questions that we're getting are about a lot of people wondering what happens if Le Pen wins. So I guess the question is that we're seeing the most is sort of, how or what effect will a Le Pen victory have outside of France in terms of strengthening this rise of the right that we're seeing, throughout Europe and North America, well, US, and what kinds of lessons will other right-wing parties take from that?
Shall I go, or Jean, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words. I mean, I think, so yeah, I think, you know, if Le Pen wins, I mean, unfortunately, I don't know if I think there'll be a sort of increased push from the left. Actually, I think it'll just portend further elections, or, you know, the further rise of the far right. And, you know, again, as I've said, more of a mainstreaming of this far right discourse. So I think, you know, I don't, at the risk of sounding hyperbolic, I do think it is really scary, and thinking about the implications, not just for France, but for Europe more generally.
I think if Le Pen wins the presidency on Sunday, first of all, that's a constitutional right. She will be able to appoint a prime minister, and the prime minister will form a government. So that's really something which is, you know, she can do straight away. But of course, and that's the big question mark here for French politics in the future, if she wins, is that she won't have a majority in the House, in the National Assembly, to help her pass legislation, you know, and in order to implement a program. And that is really the big unknown if she wins again, because at the moment she has a handful of MPs. Herself, she's an MP, she's a deputy. And it would take, I think, according to many observers, and I think I'm one of them, thinking that it would be hard for her to achieve a majority in the House. You know, it would be very, very hard. So very hard to sort of foresee, and I don't want to try to read in a crystal ball what could happen, but it is really, it would be very difficult. You know, if Macron gets reelected, for sure, the general election, which by the way will happen which will take place, sorry, in June, should give him a majority, if not something close to majority, in which case he would try to sort of get support on the center left and among les Républicains. But if Le Pen wins, that's really something really is going to be extremely puzzling and very tense situation, because if she doesn't get a majority to help her pass legislation, there are a number of things she can do, notably in international affairs, in Europe. But when it comes really to the nitty-gritty of politics, passing laws, bills, she'll be blocked. You know, it's a bit like when you have here a US president who has a House of Representative and Senate against him. You know, his room for maneuver is very limited. That would be worse here, because without it is called, there's a French word, it's cohabitation. Mm-hmm. So in that case, if she doesn't get a majority, she would have to appoint a minister who is not from her own party, but who is from the party which just won the election. We had that situation, I think, 3 times before. So it could be, for instance, someone coming from Macron's party or Mélenchon's party, the left. And incidentally, Mélenchon said, I think it was yesterday, he said that, give me a majority, talking to the French voters, give me a majority in the House and I will be the next prime minister. And whoever gets elected president, Macron or Le Pen, it doesn't matter. I will sort of be the prime minister and I will be in a position to pass my legislation against her or his will. So that's a funny, and we've got in France that situation whenever the majorities for the president and the House are not in agreement, and that's called cohabitation. And I'm afraid that with Le Pen president, that could very well be the case.
I agree with both of my colleagues. I don't even like to speculate about a Le Pen victory. It's too horrible to contemplate. But in fact, I think she would proceed cautiously in the beginning, partly for the reasons that Philippe lays out, because she'll have a wide range of forces arrayed against her. She will also be facing violence in the streets. Let's face it, France is a demonstrative country, so she'll have to establish order at home. She'll be facing a collapse in the markets. European stock markets will react very badly. The spread with German bonds will increase, so she'll have an immediate economic problem to deal with. And for all those reasons, I think she'll be cautious and not move quickly to implement any of her more radical moves. She'll try to restore order, which will be necessary at first. And she may not be able to restore order, frankly. I think things could get out of hand quite quickly if she's elected.
We may be due for a new republic after all. It's been a while, so
Yeah.
much like to change. I study revolution, so
yeah, that's one way that can happen. Yeah.
I love 19th century France, so I'm always good for another change.
Also, I should add, I don't think Mélenchon has much of a chance of being elected prime minister or achieving a majority in the parliament. His 20%, 22% in the first round was largely a consequence of the vote utile, the useful vote. People on the left who did not really support him, were not part of his base, which I think is 8 to 9%, felt that he was the one surviving hope for the left. But in the National Assembly elections, the picture will be very different. I mean, the socialists who were demolished at the national level still have lots of local power bases and will elect a certain number of representatives, as will all the other parties that did not do well in the national elections, but can do well in these parliamentary elections. So Mélenchon, I don't think, is anywhere near as popular as he's trying to pretend that he is. It's a tactical maneuver on his part.
So we're running out of time. So I want to give time to you all to give some concluding thoughts. And there's many places where this could go. But, you know, we brought up some big issues like, you know, Art framed it as why has hatred of Macron reached the point that it has. Philippe brought up earlier, like what explains the collapse of the two big, you know, the traditional parties, the Republican and the Socialists. But so there's those issues, but there's, you know, there's been the issues of race and immigration that we've discussed. So there's a lot going on. So I guess I'm going to ask you the question that we said we would ask you as the final, and that has been a question that our audience has asked. But in that question, so I'm going to ask it, what are your predictions for what's going to happen in the second round, which you've pretty much already given. But, and also kind of what should we look for in the debate tonight, shortly, given the time difference. What are we looking for in the debate? What is the message to the voters going to be? But sort of just your concluding thoughts on what are the big issues that we should be focusing on as we look towards this second round and try to understand what's going on in France right now. So let's start the way we started. We'll start with Philippe, and we'll have Jean, and then Art get the final word.
Okay, Alison, there's not much time left, so I'll be very brief. I think tonight in this debate, I expect Macron to be very much statesmanlike, probably dominate the debate again, not in the way he did it 5 years ago, where I think Le Pen was extremely poor. She'll probably be better, but I think on the whole, I can't see, you know, there are so many flaws and issues which Le Pen would be very, very at a disadvantage, you know, that I think in the end, I don't think that the debate will make a big difference. In the end, I think I may proven wrong that Macron will get reelected on Sunday. It will be a sort of a close this time. And after that, I think what will happen next, it's anyone's guess, because it could be more of the same, what we've seen the past 5 years. It will be Macron's last term. He can't run again next time. So he will probably be less inhibited than he was, in a sense that, you know, he's got nothing to lose. So some of his flagship reforms like pension, which is controversial, he might really force it upon the French. That might trigger more social movements. I expect this sort of thing. It will be a bit chaotic. It will be versatile. And my last point is now French politics is no longer dominated by a left and a right and a dominant parties on the center left and a dominant party on the center right. Now you've got 3 blocks, one conservative liberal led by Macron, one nationalist far right led by Le Pen, there's also Zemmour, and one left-wing one, very weak and very also not united. And of course, none of them can't get really a majority on its own. So that's why I think that I expect French politics to be versatile and volatile, and messy.
Jean, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think messy is a great word. So I think, I'm never comfortable making, political predictions, but I do think that, if Macron wins, it'll be a very close race in ways that I think are very worrying. And I think, one thing that I think is, we can look to in France, regardless of who wins, is unfortunately a, heightened or continued heightening of Islamophobia and a sort of crackdown on the presence and the existence of Muslims in France. So unfortunately, I think whoever wins, I'm not particularly optimistic moving forward. I think we're going to continue to have the same discourse, the same sort of Islamophobic discourse, which again has been mainstream, especially in the last few years, that's going to sort of legitimize all kinds of policies and procedures, no matter who is elected.
Well, what this election reminds me of is the whole past of my career as an observer of French politics, which began in 1968. I was attracted to French politics because I thought American politics was quite boring. The Democrats and the Republicans were more or less on the same wavelength, blanc bonnet, bonnet blanc, as they say in French. And French politics, by contrast, was deeply polarized between a left, which still had Marxist tinges, and a right, which was deeply conservative, but also highly cultivated in a way that the American right was not. I thought French politics was more intelligent. Intellectuals were deeply involved in it. They argued passionately about the issues of politics. And I found that all very attractive. Over the next 50 years, I watched the French right wing and left wing converge toward each other. They became quite similar, as I said earlier, to the point where they were rejected by people far to their right and far to their left. And so now we have a center in France, which Macron has occupied. It's not that the center has disappeared. The center left and center right parties have disappeared, but the political space they once occupied is now occupied by Macron. And because he occupies that center alone, he has become the target of all the hatreds from both sides, from the far left and the far right. He embodies to his core all the defects and all the virtues of the French governing class. I mean, he's intelligent, he's well-trained, he understands the issues, but he has a tendency to reveal his arrogance and to show that he believes himself to be better placed than the ordinary citizen to judge what's good for them. Nobody likes to be told what's good for them. In a democracy, people like to make their own decisions. So I think somehow France has to overcome this division between its elite and its broader population. That's also true of all other democracies, as Thomas Piketty showed in his last book, which I also translated, Capital and Ideology. I think it's a problem for all of us who belong to the intellectual classes to find ways to communicate more effectively to people who do not have our educational benefits. And I think the fact that we've failed to do that is one of the problems from which all our democracies are suffering. So I think I'll end with that point. I don't know whether it's pessimistic or optimistic. I do hope that we can find our way out of this mess, but I think we are, as Philippe said so eloquently, in a deep mess.
Yes.
Yes, well, I think that's the theme. And one of these days, I hope to do one of these sessions on politics and not feel like there's something little sad happening in the background of everything. But I really appreciate you all joining us and helping to provide these reflections and your insights on what's going on in France. It's so interesting to see both the similarities and the differences. And I know I speak for our audience in thanking you for being here, but I also want to thank our attendees who participated and asked so many lively questions. So thank you all and have a good afternoon and a good evening.
Thank you.